David, what a year it's going to be. We just had Ron DeSantis underscore the fact that if he was made president as a result of the vote, he would pardon Donald Trump. He said, I've always been in, but let me state it like unequivocally. So you've got everybody running against Trump on the one hand, and yet also pledging to pardon the former president as well. But Trump's argument in his bid for absolute immunity from the general effort to remove him from a ballot, to find him culpable in any way for J6, he's arguing, and this is sort of a Hail Mary, that his Senate impeachment trial should essentially act as a way to keep him out of the double jeopardy associated with another trial. I wonder if you could speak to that.
I'm going to have a hard time not laughing because this is such a ridiculous argument. First of all, the Constitution specifically provides that if you are impeached and removed from office, you can still be prosecuted for whatever crimes you may have committed, whether or not they have anything to do with the impeachment. But Trump's lawyers have made an even more ridiculous argument. Namely, well, he wasn't convicted of impeachment, therefore he cannot be prosecuted. I marvel at the creativity of his lawyers. They're the kind of people who, as a politician long ago said, could easily pass under the belly of a snake with their top hats on. It's
Solo.
Yeah. I mean, this is just an absurd argument. And all Trump is doing is trying to muddy very clear waters, to delay in the hopes that he can delay everything past the election. And, you know, as soon as the trial gets on track, it'll either be the Washington, D.C. trial or the Atlanta trial in all likelihood that go. He will immediately say, you're interfering with my presidential election. Well, so what? That has nothing to do with the price of eggs. But, you know, it's Donald. And there are, unfortunately, lots of people who don't know anything about the law at all. And I remind your readers, while I am not an attorney, I have been teaching at a law school now for 15 years.
Yeah, you're a lecturer and well-respected in these areas. Yeah, exactly.
And this is just utter nonsense from him. And I'm surprised that the courts continue to not act with his threats to people. After he went after the Maine Secretary of State, who said he's not fit to be on the ballot, but the court should then rule on my decision, Trump went after her. And immediately she was getting serious threats against her person. And this has happened to numerous other people. This is clearly a two-pronged strategy. One is to pollute the jury pool, and the other is to intimidate witnesses. General Mark Milley is not going to be intimidated. He's a valorous combat officer. But the Maine Secretary of State, ordinary witnesses, many of them will be intimidated. They don't want to have the angst and the trouble and the risk that someone will actually do something to them. And let's not forget that a guy broke into Nancy Pelosi's house, and while the cops were standing there, pounded her husband Paul's head with a hammer.
Yeah, I love that you've gotten into this place because it's where I wanted to question you anyway, and that's in the area of how Trump's, as you suggest, completely legally specious, ridiculous notion that the impeachment, that the second impeachment case somehow would create double jeopardy if you were to try him for these other things. And as you say, that's just legally absurd. It would be laughed out. But you also said, and this is to the point, two things. One, that it muddies the water, which I really feel is so important, particularly with the media grabbing whatever morsel they can, and more to the point, the siloed media, like the right-wing media in the case of the anti-Trump, the pro-Trump people, and the siloed media and MS and et cetera for the anti. That it begins to be just another argument that's thrown into the hopper, and there's no distinguishing feature, the absurd argument from the sound argument. And then you mentioned the physical threat. I mean, it makes me quite concerned for the intimidation and then the muddying of what's real and what's not in the months ahead.
Well, and you're going to see this ramp up more. Donald, who I've known for 35 years, his Truth Social posts are becoming increasingly unhinged. He is saying wilder and wilder things that are no doubt being fed to him by sycophants. That Donald is like David Irving, the Holocaust denier, who got a trial. He sued a professor of history in London, and there was a trial, and he was judicially found to be a Holocaust denier and showed how he cherry-picked things and ignored other things. Donald is like that. He cherry-picks things, and he's hoping that his audience, and remember, I love the poorly educated is his line, not mine. He has poorly educated people believing all sorts of nonsense about our Constitution that just isn't there. Of course, Donald has no idea what's in the Constitution. But this is going to get worse. It's not going to get better. It is going to get worse.
He doesn't have any concern, I think, about the Constitution. He's said it. He's almost said it in as straightforward a way as he can. But what I would also say, oh, you were fine before you did that, David.
I know. I'm trying a new lens.
I like
now.
it. Oh, that looks good. Does that work? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that works.
So
with my Tony background.
I like it. It's always interesting what the backgrounds that we choose. You know what I mean? Like, that's a good background. It's very balanced in terms of it.
When I get all my books back on the shelf and the room organized, I'll go back to my actual office background. We had a broken pipe, and we still haven't fully put everything back.
Will you speak to this that comes in on the chat? Unfortunately, Trump is likely to still be the Republican nominee. I think that is the case, and is up in the polls in swing states against Biden. Can you speak to where we are in the cycle right now and how concerned we should be about this?
Well, first and foremost, I wouldn't put any reliance whatsoever in the polls.
Right.
Barack
You said
Obama
before
was
that
not going to get a second term at this point.
Right.
And secondly, as the pollster John Geraci writes in his book Polarized, and he's told me one-on-one, only about 1% of people who are called by pollsters are accepting the request to answer questions. That is inherently not a reliable group. No matter how big you think your sample is, you have to get to 1,504 people to have a decent random sample nationally. You're not getting a proper sample. And so I pay very little attention to the polls. But the person who wrote in makes a really excellent point. Trump can lose this election by 10 million votes or more and still get back to the White House because of the Electoral College. And so if he wins a bunch of states in the Midwest, again, if he gets Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania, which is East Coast state, and some others, he can get back into the White House through the Electoral College, which is how he got in the first time. So what the Democrats have to do, and the people who are opposed to Donald Trump, and those are not the same, lots of the people opposed to Donald Trump are independents or Republicans, is they really need to focus on getting the vote out in the 13 states that could go either way. You live in California, I live in New York, they're both going to vote for Biden. Louisiana is going to vote for Donald Trump. No two ways about it. So it doesn't matter what happens in those states. What matters is going to be in these states that could go one way or the other. And the most effective way to get people to the polls is to knock on doors. It's the same thing with investigative reporting. I mean, the very best investigative reporting, you go and you knock on people's doors and you persuade them to let you into your living room. And that's what needs to happen here. Groups like Indivisible, the Democrats, don't waste money on TV ads. There's lots of research. The TV ads shift about 1/3 of 1% of the electorate. They're highly ineffective. Put the money into getting people registered, then on election day, getting people to the polls, and on election day, having tons of lawyers, so many, hopefully, that courthouses shut down all across the country, who will deal with efforts to deny people the right to vote.
Sadly, that is, I feel, something that is a playbook that both sides know. I mean, the flooding the courts with lawyers is something that I feel the right has probably done more effectively than the left.
Yeah, no, they have. I agree with you about that. In the case of the getting people to the polls, The Democrats, though, don't have the organizational level that the Republicans do. And I tell you from many lectures I've given to political groups, Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, independents, conservatives, that in general, my experience has been that when I go to speak to a group of Republicans or conservatives, they're very organized. We're going to start at this minutes after the clock. You have this much time. We're going to have this many time. We're going to be out the door. And they run it well. You go to a Democratic meeting and you're a half hour past when dinner's over, and they're still milling around talking. And you say, well, shouldn't we get started? Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. They really need to develop business-like approaches to meeting and organizing.
David, it's so interesting. I'm seeing in the chat people scared for all the reasons that you've suggested that Trump will become president. What will happen? America feels as though it's really on the brink. There's something about Trump, and this is why it's so, I have to say it's a luxury to be able to speak to you, because you know this guy so well, and you've written about him so in such a detailed way. So I come to this. He feels like a unicorn to me. You can see it in the people who are on stage now running against him. Trump is oddly charismatic and is a showman. He's a BS artist and a horrible, malevolent force, but he is charismatic, and nobody else in that party has that. I'm wondering if you could speak to, if you could slay this dragon, metaphorically, obviously, do we get back to normal, or is that my normalcy bias kicking in?
Yeah, first of all, let's not slay unicorns. They're supposed to be nice.
Right. I'm sorry. Okay. I meant one off. Yeah.
Donald has demonstrated that he is a leader. Ronald Reagan, whatever you think of Ronald Reagan, you love him and think he was the greatest president ever, or you think he was a complete disaster, you can't dispute that he was a leader. He changed the country and got us to kill the New Deal and replace it with Reaganism. And human beings are herd animals. Most of us, not all of us, but the vast majority of us, we want to follow some leader. And Donald has captured that ground with a large number of people, especially people who their economic circumstances have not been good. They're furious about the civil rights movement, but haven't, and the feminist movement and the LGBTQ movement, because to get along in decent society, couldn't say what they think in their hearts, their evil, dark hearts. And these crazy people who call themselves Christians, but don't believe in Christianity at all. They believe in revenge, which is antithetical to Christianity. And no question that Donald is very good at that. I mean, I call him the greatest con artist in the history of the world, and that's what con artists do. And if you're a mark of a con artist, it's very hard to admit that you were had. There's plenty of news stories out there about the husband or the wife who lost all their money in one of the Nigerian prince scams, couldn't tell their spouse about it, and finally, committed suicide or something like that because they just couldn't face what they had done. And so to expect the diehard Trump supporters to come to their senses, that's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. I'm not worried about the American people as a whole. They will reject Donald Trump. He will not get a majority of the vote, even with all the voter suppression efforts going on. For example, in Florida, about 90% of the people who've been kicked off the voter rolls turn out to be Democrats or independents. I'm worried about the electoral college issue, and that's where effort should be. And when people ask me on some other shows where there's call-in, have asked me, what do you do? I said, if you have the financial circumstances to do this, connect up with some place where there's a swing state, where there's also a congressional race that might get swung. Connect up with people there, make hotel reservations now, go stay there for several days before the election. Need to be two of you. So if you're not a couple, get a friend to come. And on election day, drive people to the polls. We have GPS now. You can go to some town you've never been to and find people's addresses and drive them to the polls. Get young people to go to the polls. Voters under 25 who historically didn't vote very much, despite, when I was a young man, the huge fight to get the right to vote. Excuse me about that. I apologize.
Sure. That's all right. I also, just as you mentioned young people, David, I'll just say this. I mean, I think the young people, and again, this might be a sign of, the working class having, the Democrats having lost the connection to the working class that they had.
Yeah.
I think the young people in this country, there's been a lost connection between them and the Democrats to a degree. I don't know if,
actually, the voting records show that young people are very much pro-Biden. They reject this trickle-down economics that came in, and the trickle-down is a term the Democrats devised to make Reagan look bad, but the concept is valid. They reject all of that. They reject the Chicago school theories that behavioralist economists have been knocking down for years. And I'm somebody who went to as you can see in my shirt, if you're watching on the screen, the Chicago school to study economics at the doctoral level. I don't think young people are a problem except for getting them to the polls and overcoming these efforts to say you can't vote where you're going to school. You got to vote where your parents are. We need to work really hard on that. And here's an important idea to keep in mind. Our liberties, our freedoms as Americans, they are guaranteed for 12 months, 2 weeks, and 5 more days. On January 20th, 2025, if Donald Trump is sworn in again, it's over. He has declared, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. And if you can show me any dictator in the world who was dictator for 1 day and then relinquished that position, I'll give $1,000 to the charity of your choice. It doesn't exist. It's a no-risk venture.
This is interesting, and I'll for a moment just indulge looking at that comment, because you can say, hey, look, David, I get that Trump said I'll be a dictator on day one because I want the border shut, or I want the military to go to the border, and I want to drill, baby, drill. That's what he said. That was and you can go, well, that's just Trump, making points about what his priorities will be, and he's putting them, and he doesn't know better, in the form of the dictator banner. You'd say, no, he's showing you his real hand?
Not only would I say that, but in his first administration, the second book in my Trump trilogy, it's even worse than you think. I show where in many places he did what he said he was going to do. He put people in danger of bomb trains. There's a whole chapter about that in the book. To curry favor with a major political donor. Was literally going to put the possibility of 1 million people dying, certainly hundreds of thousands of people dying, to please this donor in something that was totally unsafe. He did get to the polluters a thick book of here's every weak point in the clean water laws that you can go after to try and defeat the clean water laws. He just didn't get everything done because he's incompetent at that. Now he has Project 2025. He has a whole bunch of people around him who are zealots, and they are out there on the far right outlets like Newsmax telling people, here's what we're going to do as soon as we get in office. We're going to get a law passed that you can't write anything about Donald Trump unless he approves of it. Well, that's the end of freedom of the press. That's the end of freedom of speech. We're going to get a law passed that there's going to be prayer in the schools. Well, that's the end of no establishment of religion. And they've cited all sorts of other things they're going to do. The borders, rounding people up, deporting people, reducing access to the courts, which has been going on for a long time. They're just going to ramp it up. So yes, pay attention to what he says. And I would argue that to even joke that you're going to be dictator for 1 day is completely out of bounds. It is completely inappropriate, and Mark, it shouldn't happen. And I suspect you're going to see the Biden administration, they've been keeping their powder dry because they don't want to too soon make news and then it'll be forgotten. Biden's going to run on soft landing, incredibly strong economy, wages growing faster than prices. Inflation is now down for the last 6 months to the Fed's target at 2%. You don't want zero inflation because everything is rigid. You want a little bit of inflation.
Add to that, the stock market's on a tear. I mean,
the stock market is hit new records more than once now. And in addition, among the G7 nations, the 7 biggest economies in the world, we're doing gangbusters. Any chart you want to look at, wages, jobs, etc. The U.S. is way up here. The only other country with real wage gains is Canada, and they're minute. Ours are real, and they're concentrated among people making less than $50,000 a year. So, and that's where Trump has really worked on his, quote, poorly educated group, is to get people who they're angry and upset, and they don't know why the economy hasn't been as good for them as it was for dad or grandpa.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember you writing a piece about that, the fact that the lower incomes have actually benefited enormously from this administration. I mean, it may, I don't know if it's Bidenomics, as they call it, or whatever, but it's interesting then that we're so motivated and we are so driven by personality that we deny these facts that you've just mentioned.
And Joe Biden is boring. I mean, I wouldn't, there's nothing charismatic about him, but he's the first president, I would argue, since Lyndon Johnson, maybe you could argue Jerry Ford, who was a placeholder, who actually knows how Washington works. We kept electing these outsiders, you know, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a U.S. Senator long enough to have a cup of coffee on Capitol Hill and then announce he was running. And Joe Biden has been a senator since he was 30 years old, or then vice president, and then he was out of office for 4 years. He knows how the world works, and he has a record many people don't know about. And one example of that is when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the Serbs were engaging in genocide against in what my best friend calls Bosnia schizophrenia. Biden flew there, sat down with Milosevic face to face, and told him, if you don't knock off these massacres, we're going to arrest you and put you in prison. And I think he made it pretty clear, kill him. They could have killed Biden right then. You think Donald Trump has the guts to go confront a mass killer like that? No. Biden knows what he's doing, and he's got lots of problems to deal with. I mean, he's, you know, we have this absolutely ham-handed, unnecessarily violent assault going on in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. Israel has every right to defend itself. It has every right to go after Hamas leaders and soldiers. But when you drop big bombs on apartment buildings and schools and hospitals, those are war crimes. And they aren't achieving your goal, your stated goal, or your purpose. And we have this trouble with Putin, whose military has now been severely depleted. And the Republicans have cut off funding. And it would be very interesting to see if Biden can get any more funding for the Ukrainians, because clearly the Russians have just run through most of their stuff. They're using North Korean artillery shells that are unreliable because the powder in them isn't consistent in terms of the charge it gives. So you set all of the dials and markers, you know, for a piece of artillery to go to a certain place, and it goes somewhere else.
Well, boy, you really summarized here in our last minute or so with you the inflection point that this administration faces. We face as a nation, but certainly Biden and his people couldn't find a more difficult thing to navigate than what you're having. I mean, the Houthis firing on shipping vessels. You've got, I mean, to just to broaden even some of what you've talked about. So you have Middle East tensions really beginning to boil over. I'd suggest that Hamas is getting exactly what they wanted with that attack, even more. I mean, it has turned Israel into essentially a world outcast. It's also created. Yeah,
no, they want to make Israel a pariah state, and unfortunately, Netanyahu is playing right into their hands.
Yeah. So and yet that for another time. But I mean, there's so few good options on that table. So you know, back to our politics. Biden's got his work cut out for him, and Trump, of course, just has the, hey, let me tell you, I've got a plan. It's all going to be better when I get in. This guy's an idiot. You know, the world's on fire because of this guy being an idiot. When I get in, I'm not an idiot. I'll get things cleaned up before lunch. You know, that's basically Trump's rap. David, love talking to you. I'm looking forward to a great new year together. Wishing you all the best, and thank you again. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.